My brother Matthew has decided to join us. He only comes on about once every 6 months, so thank you very much. He actually just rolled into the office about 20 minutes ago.
How do you put up with that?
It's all right. I mean, he's my little brother, so Mom says I got to look out for him. We also have in the palatial WLKF studio Mr. Gary York. Gary is a retired prison inspector with the Florida Department of Corrections, and he's going to have some great stories to tell. So we encourage you to tune in for the entire hour tonight. Let's begin. Gary, you used to be with the Department of Corrections, the prison system, and you just wrote a book. Give us an overview of what the book's about.
Yes, sir. First of all, thank you very much for having me on the show tonight. And my book, Corruption Behind Bars, is a series of short stories about correctional officers and other prison staff members involved in the world of corruption. And this book takes a look at prison crime and corruption through the eyes of the investigator. Many prison books are written about prisoners and about the officer, what the officer sees through his eyes. And I thought that since I didn't see any books out there through the eyes of the investigator, I thought I would give it a shot and let people know what really goes on in the world of prison in Florida.
When did you retire from the Department of Corrections?
I retired in 2005.
All right. Well, let's get right to it. You know, we had was he the Secretary of the Department of Corrections, Mr. Crosby?
Yes, sir.
It's kind of a sad story to tell. The fellow that was in charge of the Department of Corrections, which includes the entire prison system, also probation and parole, is now in federal prison. Tell us how that happened.
Yes, sir. And he actually just finished his 8-year federal prison sentence, and he got out last year, actually, in May. But it's a shame that in order to stop corruption, we need our leaders to be honest and law-abiding citizens. But unfortunately, in James Crosby's reign with the Florida Department of Corrections, corruption ran all the way to the top, starting with him and all the way down to some of his supervisors throughout the state of Florida.
What broke it? What broke the story? I mean, it always starts with something. The guy was all the way at the top. I suspect maybe there were some whispers, but for the most part, he was running the show because I knew some people at the Department of Corrections. I mean, he was pretty well respected by a lot of people in that agency. What was the beginning of the end for him?
Well, what happened was he, unlike other leaders of the Department of Corrections in past years, he was spending money at hotels and having parties with a lot of the staff members throughout the state. He was taken around in a limousine where others would drive their state car. People started to notice that he was having more and more parties, and then there were fights breaking out at these parties. He began to hire professional baseball players to play on his softball team so that his team up in Tallahassee could win the trophy. He was paying them a state salary of $30,000 a year, and they never even stepped foot in the prison to do any work at all, but they had to be an employee to play on the softball team. And some of these parties got out of hand. There were fights, there were brawls, there were women up in the hotel rooms. And
Gary, I read that there was steroids played a big part in that softball team.
The softball team was receiving steroids from Egypt, a former correctional officer. And this whole story, by the way, is in the book. But a former correctional officer had gone to Egypt, and his girlfriend remained in the Tallahassee area, and actually in the Iron Triangle area up by Bradford County. And she reported her boyfriend getting these steroids back into the United States from Egypt to the Florida Department of Corrections softball team. And that got the ball rolling with her complaint to law enforcement. When she had a falling out with him, she reported what he had been doing.
What was the Steele's guy with softball? Like, what was he, like, really important to him to win this trophy?
You know, everybody
it's
just
the
sits
longest
back
yard
and
with the
wonders.
football game, you know.
Right. It's not about honor, or
Everybody sits back and wonders, why is it so important to have the #1 softball team and the championship trophy every year? What kind of ego must a person have?
Who were they playing? Other prison systems?
They were playing other prisons throughout the state.
Okay.
All other prisons and regions had softball teams, but Mr. Crosby wanted his Florida State prison softball team to be #1 every year.
and he's willing to give it all up just for that.
That, and then there were some issues. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement supervisor, his son was a correctional officer up in that area, and he had gotten into an off-duty brawl, and they were going to punish him. And that's when he decided to go to his father and say, "Dad, this is what's going on in the Department of Corrections."
How much money was Mr. Crosby making off those commissaries and things like that?
That was the commissaries with the American Institutional Services out of Gainesville, Florida. They were snacks provided to inmates and for their families. And he was getting kickbacks in the amount of $124,000. He was getting anywhere from $1,000 to $12,000 a month kickbacks. And he ended up with a total of $124,000 in his pocket from those kickbacks. And the deputy secretary, Alan Clark, ended up with $94,000 in kickbacks. You combine all these things we just talked about, and a wide open investigation took place with the FBI and FDLE.
How many? I mean, they cleaned house after this. Who did they get rid of?
Well, of course, James Crosby had an 8-year prison sentence. The deputy secretary, his right-hand man, Alan Clark, had a 2-year prison sentence. 90 supervisors were either terminated or received some type of punishment, such as probation and loss of all their certifications. All in all, 280 people approximately were weeded out of the Department of Corrections from Tallahassee all the way down to Miami.
Anybody lose any pensions?
Yes. Mr. Crosby lost a 30-year pension.
Oh, my gosh. I mean, folks, that's a lot of money.
That's tons of money. He lost his pension, and he also has to pay restitution now that he's out of prison. Both he and Mr. Clark have to pay restitution back in the amount that they had embezzled.
Did he plea in federal court?
He pled in federal court. Both of them did. Yes.
Oh.
All right, when we come back from the break, Mr. York is going to tell you how you can go about finding his book, and we're going to go, he's going to tell us some more specific stories, some of his investigations, and also we're going to talk about what it's like to be a young man on your way to prison. We'll be right back.
Howdy, folks.
Our group in McMahon, PA. Gary, my father-in-law was a prison warden at Hardy Correctional. I know he also worked at Avon Park Correctional, and one day I asked him, I said, you know, you hear these stories about what happens to young men when they make their way into the prison system. Is it true? And, you know, what, if anything...
And how can I get there?
Yeah, right. And what, if anything, can be done to prevent... what, if anything, can be done to prevent it? And, you know, let me ask you the same question. Because it was your job to investigate these incidents, I assume. Is it true? Who are the most likely, you know, people to be... violated, and is there anything that can be done about it? Has the situation improved?
Well, in all the investigations that I did concerning rape of prisoners, unfortunately, a lot of the victims that I sat across from were young men, and they all seemed to have the same type features. They were younger, white males, blonde hair. They didn't have to have blue eyes, but the blue eyes didn't hurt. And unfortunately, they were the victims of most of the rapes that I investigated. The older inmates seem to look at the younger inmates and see a cleaner person. They may not be cleaner, but in the eyes of the older inmates, this is a young, clean inmate, and if they wish to have relations with them, they're going to have it one way or another.
Is there anything that, you know, you're some 20-year-old kid on a, you know, broke into a car, you violated probation, you know, you get in a year and a day. Does it make any difference? I mean, these kids aren't going off to Rayford, and sometimes people would think, well, this would only happen at the max security prisons. My father-in-law, who was a warden, said, well, no, not necessarily. Sometimes it would happen at some of these other prisons because there wasn't as much security. You answered that question, and do you agree or disagree? And was it almost inevitable for the person that you described, 130-pound, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white male, you know, that fits the description? Is it going to happen to that kid?
It's going to happen unless a couple of things occur. Some inmates are fortunate to come from wealthy families. In prison, money is power. Money is better than muscle. So if they had money, they could have their family send money to enforcers, big, strong inmates, to protect them, and they would be safe. Some would check into protective confinement. And like you said, if they had a year and a day, they might be able to ride that sentence out in protective confinement.
What does that mean, protective confinement?
Protective custody means I'm an inmate in fear of being injured or raped on a compound, and I run the classification and say, look, I'm getting injured, I'm being raped, I want to be put in protective custody.
But it has to happen before you
Unfortunately, things have to happen, and it has to be proven that it's happening before they'll go to PC, as they call it.
So once again, like this kid that's, you know, maybe you got a 2 or 3 year stretch, is there sad to say, is there anything that can be done to protect him? If he doesn't have any money, I mean, if he's some
After I would do an investigation and have them sent to medical and get a rape kit done, I would put them. I would find out who the suspects were who raped them, and I would have them separated from each other permanently in the records, so they would never be at the same prison together. But unfortunately, you transfer him to another prison. You're doing everything you can within your power to protect this guy, but he's at another prison.
Yeah.
There's more inmates. They spot somebody they like right away. 1,100 inmates in the prison, 26 officers on duty.
Are those the proportions for a minimum, medium, or maximum, or is it just sort of a general rule of thumb?
I just gave you a general example of the way lots of prisons are. Some prisons have more on duty and some have less, but there's always way outnumbered, the inmates way outnumber the officers, and the officers can't see every nook and cranny in the prison. They can't be everywhere in the prison.
Yeah, and I, Matt, you do the same thing. We've got these young guys, and they'll be placed on probation. They'll violate probation, and I'm like, man, do you understand what's going to be waiting on you when you get to prison? Do you not get that? These aren't urban legends. This is going to happen, and just for the life of me, I'm just mystified sometimes. Why it seems? I mean, I would be towing the line if I thought there was any chance I was going to end up in prison. Now, let me ask you this. Mark, Matt, and I are in prison. Which one of us is going to last the longest?
Well, out of the three of you, I think Mark has the best shot. He's got the dark hair. He might have a better shot at.
But he's really good looking. I think they're just going to swarm him.
I don't know. I don't know if that's a compliment or not.
Look, I have to go with you as being the most likely.
Dave, you're the most likely.
What? To last the longest?
No.
Not to last the
What
longest.
are you talking about?
You go down in an hour and a half.
No way, dude. I would. No way. I guarantee you, I would.
I mean, you threw the question out there. I had to answer.
You're great. I'm 44 years old. They're not going to. They're going to want Matthew. He's cute as a button.
Hey, Gary. On a serious note, what about escapes? Did you investigate any prisoner escapes?
Yes. There's some chapters in this book about actual escapes that I investigated, and it tells you step by step how the inmate escaped, things we found in his property, maps that they had come up with, escape paraphernalia, and I will kind of walk you through what the inmate's mind was going through and how he planned his escape, and then I take you out as we're following him and trying to recapture the inmate.
Is there anybody that successfully escaped and never was recaptured?
The longest one that I'm aware of during my reign as a prison inspector, there was a large escape from Glades Correctional Institution. That 6 of them tunneled out. 5 of them were caught within weeks. 1 got away, got to California, and he actually lasted 2 or 3 years, and he got pulled over with a taillight out on his vehicle in California, and he got recaptured because of his taillight.
I had a client that was in a work release program up in North Florida, and he was gone for 20-something years before they finally caught up with him. And once again, it was some routine traffic violation. So,
right.
Work releases don't count. I mean, you can just walk off there.
Yeah, that's true. I guess that's not really what you were talking about.
Yeah, we're talking about. I think. Well, my book is geared towards behind the razor wire.
How can we find your book?
The book is available on Amazon, on Kindle version or paperback. It's available. These are all online. It's available through Barnes & Noble online, Books A Million. If you're an ebook person, you can get it on library.com or Kobo eBooks. I think there's about 25 sites out there with my book.
How are the sales going?
On Kobo ebook, and I brought it with me today. I pulled it up Friday, and out of 156 Kobo ebooks listed under the social penology section, it's number 1.
Terrific.
Right now. Amazon, it's been in and out. It's only been out 9 months. It's been in and out of the top 100 penology books over those 9 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's called Corruption Behind Bars by Gary York, folks. You hop on the internet and type that in, and you'll pop up probably a half dozen places where you can buy it. Once again, Corruption Behind Bars by Gary York.
No, I saw a movie over the weekend, and I got to admit, ever since the election, I've been watching with whatever my girlfriend wants to watch, which happens to be Lifetime movies. I'm going to admit
whatever your girlfriend wants to watch.
so I'm watching this movie, and there is a prison guards, and the lead prison guard is played by an actor. He played Jack Arnold, Kevin Arnold's dad, and for me, being a young guy, what was the movie? Kevin Arnold. the TV show.
Growing Pain or
No.
The Wonder Years?
The Wonder Years, yeah. So I kept thinking, okay, that's Kevin's
That guy looks
dad.
like a prison guard.
He did it really well, but I can't get the fact he's Kevin Arnold's dad out of my mind, right? But anyway, he's ahead of this whole prostitution ring, and he's ahead of a woman's prison. Were there any ever situations that you saw like that where prisoners were actually paying individuals, and the prison guards were doing what they were doing with the women as well? But they would take these women out and get money for the services. Did you ever have-
Prostitution. I have seen prostitution in the Florida prison system. Gang members that are in prison will find other gang members, females, that have no prior record. They have a clean record. So if an NCIC, FCIC check is done on them, they'll be clean. They'll tell them to apply for a job at the prison. They'll apply for a job at the prison. They have a clean record. They get into the prison system. They're making a state paycheck, and on the side, they're selling themselves to the inmates, prostituting themselves. So
This happened in the Florida prison system.
Yes, inmates have actually started their own prostitution ring in the prison, and gang members have found ways to get their own people into the prison system.
And then you were saying before we started the show that, going back to the example of the young kid that gets up there, sometimes these poor kids are pimped out as well, aren't they?
Yes. If an inmate becomes one of the older inmates' lovers, and he wants some marijuana or some alcohol that's been smuggled into the prison, he may loan that inmate out for an hour or two in exchange for some marijuana or alcohol.
So they devolve, essentially? I mean, after a period of time, it's just a complete de-evolution of what would otherwise be normal societal norms.
Correct. There are inmates who have just given up. They've been pimped out and used so much that they start to evolve into acting and looking like a woman. It's just like, I give up, and now they start to try to smuggle cosmetics into the prison. Well, they don't try. They get cosmetics into prison, and they'll actually wear lipstick. They'll start to try to make themselves walk and act and talk like a woman, and they were perfectly normal men when they went into the prison system.
I think what Mark was asking is that are the people that are engaging in this sort of behavior, obviously they're criminals or they wouldn't be in prison, but you've met people, inmates that are pretty decent guys, and maybe they just made some mistakes, but fundamentally some guy that's in there that gets caught with some drugs is not necessarily a rapist or a murderer or anything like that.
Right, not a violent offender.
Not a violent offender. What sort of person, I mean, do you find that the prison system over a period of time just basically destroys the humanity of certain people, or are these people probably had that somewhere in them to begin with?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because the purpose of this book is we've got to stop some of the corruption with the officers smuggling drugs and things in. We're not there to help them evolve into worse people or worse criminals than they are. So if we don't stop the officers from smuggling drugs in, and when I say that, I want people to know there's a lot of good, honest officers out there.
Oh, the vast majority.
I'm telling you about approximately 14% here. This book talks about approximately 14%.
14% is pretty high.
Yeah, that's real high.
Well, studies have been shown, and then with my own experience, out of the 27,000 employees, it's close to 14%. My opinion, based on my observation and my years of experience.
Well, Gary, I mean, if you think about that, if we lived in a society where if 14% of the society chose to not play by the rules and not abide by the law, we would have absolute anarchy. And you're telling me that you think that we have a double-digit number of corrupt people in the Department of Correction system?
Well, if you have 27,000 employees and it averages out to 340 employee arrests per year, not including the ones that were terminated for misconduct.
Or the ones that weren't caught.
There's more terminated for misconduct than there are arrested. You add the arrests, the terminations, and the ones that aren't caught yet. I mean, these are all statistics that are on record. I mean, you can't deny that.
There's no excuse for that sort of corruption, but are we paying these guys enough to where they can raise a family?
Some of the studies blame the low pay for the cause of corruption. Some blame the code of silence. The honest officers aren't turning in the corrupt officers for fear of retaliation or sticking to the code of silence.
It's kind of like the thin blue line.
The thin blue line is exactly where I was going next with that. That's exactly the thin blue line. The other issue is some of these folks just are corrupt, and they're going right on in the prison saying, hey, Inmate Jones, I'm ready to wheel and deal. I need to make some money.
Yeah.
So you have that type too. And I blame it on a lot of the hiring process. We need to get better background checks. We need to do polygraphs. We need to do psychological evaluations. These things aren't being done when these folks are being hired.
Yeah, you get a lot of our local law enforcement agencies, both here in Polk County and throughout Central Florida. The psychological evaluation weeds out a lot of people that would otherwise pass any background check.
Right.
Do they not have the psychological evaluations for prison guards?
No, not like our local sheriff's departments who do a really good job at background checks. The Department of Corrections does not have a psychological exam. They don't have the polygraph test. And those are two areas where you take out a lot of people and weed out a lot of bad apples, I guess.
Well, is that because, quite honestly, they're in a position because it's such
too
a
discriminatory.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a difficult job, a position to fill that they can only be so picky.
That's exactly, you hit it right on the head. I believe that because they need the bodies, and that they've maybe eliminated those two areas. But I believe in the pay me now or pay me later.
Right.
I would rather pay up front for those two exams to be done than pay for the hours of investigation. I mean, some of these investigations we did over the years were hours and hours and hours. And you're paying me my hourly rate, and then when I'm over 40 hours, you're paying me time and a half. I think I'd rather pay up front, sort of the Midas thing, pay me now or pay me later.
Mm-hmm. All right, folks, we got to take a break and be right back with Gary York.
Is it possible?
All right, welcome back to Law Talk, sponsored by the Kayla Law Group in McMahon, PA. All right, Gary York is the author of Corruption Behind Bars. So you can find it on Amazon or just get on Google and put Corruption Behind Bars, and also his name, Gary York. If you just put Corruption Behind Bars, you get 1,000 different links on Google. So Corruption Behind Bars by Gary York. Gary, we'd mentioned the 14% figure, and I was kind of curious how you were able to, sort of quantify that figure. You also said that at the break, you said the Federal Bureau of Prisons came up with a figure very, very similar to that.
The Federal Bureau of Prisons and some independent university studies have come up with that number, 14%, and based on my own experience, I have to go along and agree with it. Sometimes I would wonder, if it wasn't just a little bit higher.
It was even higher, you thought.
Yeah.
We've got some prisons here, like in Hardy County and Avon Park and PCI, and we have a larger population to fill the positions that might come. But if you get up into in the Panhandle and up in the northern Florida, and they've got a bunch of prisons up there. I mean, that's the primary industry for some of these counties. I suspect that's probably where they run into trouble because the pool of qualified applicants is probably pretty shallow.
Well, I think I'm going to reverse you on this one. Most of the corruption with the drugs and drug smuggling, even though it does occur up in the Panhandle,
mm-hmm.
is going to be Central Florida all the way down to the Keys.
Okay.
And if you think about it, I hate to say this, Miami, but you Miami and drugs. There's more drugs in the Miami prisons than there are in Central Florida. There's more drugs in the Central Florida prisons than there are in the North Florida prisons. There's some
That's
third
just
and
because
fourth.
it's accessible to the guards to bring it in.
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah.
What's that? The drug
Location.
Yeah. The drugs are family members of inmates will supply all the drugs. They'll pay an officer $1,200, $1,500 cash a pop to smuggle the drugs.
Is that
in.
how the drugs come in most of the time? Is family members bring it in?
Family members bring it in through visitation, but the most desired way is an inmate gets an officer to smuggle it in for him. The officer meets the family member at a Walmart parking lot or at a Wendy's. The family member hands the officer the marijuana and cocaine and $1,200 cash. The officer pockets the $1,200. The next day he goes to work. He walks through with the drugs in his boot, and at a good opportune moment, he'll give the inmate the drugs or leave the drugs where the inmate.
Well, how are the inmates? I'm in prison. Both you guys were wrong. I ended up lasting, and I'm thriving in prison. I've got my own drug industry going on, hypothetically, and somebody brings me some drugs. How am I dealing these drugs? Who has cash on them in prison?
Well, cash is smuggled in prison too, but that's not how they're paid in most instances. 10 inmates have ordered their marijuana or cocaine. The officer brings the marijuana in and to the dealer. The inmates' families send money to a certain bank account, which is set up at a SunTrust or somewhere, Bank of America, outside by an inmate's family. The inmate gets on the phone or at visitation, where it's not recorded, and says, "Has Johnny paid?" "Yes." And he goes through his list. "These 10 inmates have had their money arrive into our bank account at SunTrust." "Yes." as soon as he confirms with his family it's the money's in the bank, he distributes the drugs to those inmates.
I guess you don't want to get on the wrong side of one of these guys either, do you?
No. And that's how a lot of officers fall. They shorten the inmate of his drugs, or they decide they want to quit, and then the inmate decides to tell the prison inspector everything that's going on, and the inmate even will wear a wire force in many instances to bring down the officer. And I've asked inmates, this guy's bringing your drugs in for you. He's your bread and butter. Why are you turning him in? Because he's shorting me on my dope. My family's giving him dope, and he's keeping some of it.
So it's kind of like the mob. I mean, once you start doing business with these guys, it's a contract that can't be broken.
It's just like the mob. Once you start dealing with an inmate, you're in for life, or he's going to take you down one way or another.
You mentioned, and we were talking and theorizing as to why they would do this, and maybe not getting paid enough. But I mean, is there any situations we kind of talked about where they're just around this crowd, and so they kind of themselves devolve? Talk about that a little bit.
Studies have been done where some officers get into this subculture for so long that they start to become friends with the inmates, and they start to see this subculture, and they start to begin to live that subculture. And they feel the inmates are their buddies or their friend, and they'll help them, and they'll get into this type situation of smuggling items in. It's not always drugs and alcohol. It could be toiletries, it could be cosmetics, it could be food, things like that.
Well, I want to talk about a very special warden. I want you, and we'll use this to sort of segue in. My father-in-law, who passed away several years ago. By the way, it's my wife's birthday today. Happy birthday, sweetie. He was a warden at Hardy Correctional. So you knew him, and I want you got a tip, an anonymous tip that somebody is selling drugs, or a guard is selling drugs at Hardy Correctional, or however, walk us through what you do to investigate a case.
Well, once we get a tip, I'm assigned a case file and a case number by my supervisor out of the Tampa Regional Office. So now I have a case at Hardy Correctional Institution. The warden was Kermit Curley, and I knew him well, talked to him many times. A very good man and a very honest man. He is not one of the wardens in my book. He never would even get close to being one of the wardens in my book. I would go into his office and ask him if he had a moment. We'd sit down, we'd start to chat a little bit, and then he would say, "Why are you here, Inspector York?" And I'd say, "Well, sir, we have an allegation that Officer Jones is smuggling drugs to inmate Smith. It's your prison. And since the warden is in charge of the prison, we need to let him know why we're there. We don't just walk in, I'm the prison inspector, I'm taking over your prison, and I'm doing this investigation. We give him the courtesy to know we're there, and we let him know why we're there." And Mr. Curley was always very receptive to prison inspectors. When a warden was receptive to a prison inspector, I knew that he loved for us to come in and clean his prison. If they weren't receptive to us, it always sent a signal to me like, why does this warden not want a prison inspector at his prison? Mr. Curley would say, anything you need, they'll get you an office set up down there in classification. We'll get you an officer to escort you inmates or whatever you need. And he was always very helpful. And I really respected him, and he was a good man, and I remember him well.
It must have been difficult for you when you would come into these places where you knew that you were, unwelcome. First of all, it's got to be intimidating just walking around the grounds of a prison as it is, knowing that you're outnumbered 30-1, and coupled with the fact that you don't know the lay of the land in that particular prison as well as, I'm sure there are certain spots where even the most experienced prison guard realizes that's not the best place to be if something should happen.
Right.
And then you find yourself walking these prison grounds, knowing that even the people that you're there to investigate, they don't like you either. I mean, that had to be uncomfortable.
Right, that's true. I didn't work there every day like the officers did. So the one thing I can tell you, the honest officers would shake my hand after an investigation and say, "Thank you for getting that corrupt officer out of here," because we always felt something was wrong with him. He didn't want to talk to us. He was super friendly with the inmates. It's the dishonest officers who hated prison inspectors. Honest officers do not dislike prison inspectors.
You mentioned that he was friendly with inmates, and it's I've always been curious. Is that how do you want to treat the inmates humanely and give them some modicum of respect, because I think you're trying to build up. I mean, ultimately, most of these people are getting out, and we want to build up their sense of self-worth. How do you balance that out? I mean, what would you recommend? I mean,
your job is care, custody, and control. and you make sure the inmate has what he needs to live, you can be firm but fair. Make them follow the rules. Don't veer off from that. But you can talk to them about football. There's nothing wrong with that. You can talk to them about the baseball game. You can talk to them about the weather, fishing, all types of things. There's nothing wrong with talking to an inmate about everyday life. But when they start to get manipulative and ask for a cigarette or a piece of gum, stop them. Stop. Nope. You don't get anything from me except, your 3 meals a day and your shower and your toiletries and the things you need. But you have to put a stop to it when they start to cross the line and manipulate you. But you can treat them just like any other human being. There's nothing wrong with that. And you should. But be firm but fair and make them follow the rules.
These guys, they run some pretty sophisticated scams in prison. Did you investigate some of those?
Tax fraud was a big scam in prison. And I did several of those. And after I did my investigation, I would always call IRS, and we would mail them a copy of the investigation. After we did what we needed to do, we would turn it over to IRS in case they wanted to pursue further charges.
What do you mean tax fraud? Tax fraud through the...
There was a case at Polk Correctional where an officer was bringing in tax forms to inmates. And the inmate law clerks, there's always law clerks at the prison who would get deceased people's names and Social Security numbers from their family. They would get these names out of the newspapers, and as soon as a person would show up as deceased, they would draw up fraudulent tax returns on these people. And they had the whole system down pat. And the inmate law clerks would fill out the forms. The officer would smuggle the form out and mail it. A check would come either to the officer or a family member. And then they had people set up in these little quick cash check places, and they would cash the check for them. And everybody would get a cut.
Now, you got to wonder if these guys would simply use their ingenuity for good. They probably could have done okay on the outside.
The ingenuity they have, you would think, my gosh, they could have run a successful business with all the time and effort they put into these scams.
All right, we got to take a break, and we're right back.
How often should I brush and floss?
All right, welcome back to the last segment of Law Talk, sponsored by the Kayla Law Group in McMahon, PA. Let's get right to it. Gary York is on the show. He is the author of Corruption Behind Bars. Once again, Gary York, Y-O-R-K, author of Corruption Behind Bars. Mark, I know that you thumbed through the book, and there was a couple stories you wanted to talk to Gary about.
Well, there's actually every chapter is interesting, but in particular, Chapter 8, the teacher who loved her inmate students. What's that all about?
Well, this was a GED teacher that was hired to teach juvenile inmates at Hillsborough Correctional Institution. And these are juveniles adjudicated as adults and sent to Florida prison system, but they're in a camp just with their own age group.
Youthful offender.
And they're under the Youthful Offender Program. And they are learning many trades in there and trying to get their GED. And her job was to get these folks trained to get their GED. And she was prostituting on the side. And family members of these youthful offenders, when I say family members, it's mostly friends. Mom and Dad wouldn't usually pay for something like this, but it would be a friend on the outside.
Mom and Dad would usually not pay for something like this. But
well, you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised at what some of the parents would pay for their kids. But once she received the money, she would take the inmate back into the restroom area outside of the portables where they were teaching the classes, and she would have sex with the inmates. Well, one inmate was very poor, didn't have anybody on the outside that could send money, and he wanted his turn with this teacher, and she told him, no money, we're not going to do anything. So he decided, I'll fix this. If I can't have my turn, I'm going to turn them in. So he turned her in to the lieutenant that was on duty. He said, this is what's going on. That's how I got involved. Make a long story short, we hid a camera in her classroom, and we gave the inmate three $20 bills, and we had that marked money, and we photographed the money and photocopied the money. We put a wire on him, and we sent him in to pay her for sex. We were in a van out in front of Hillsborough Correctional Institution, so we could see everything going in the classroom. We wanted the transaction of the money to take place. We wanted them to talk, so we would have a tape recording of their agreement, but we weren't going to allow them to have sex. And as soon
Did the kid go, you're too soon. Just give me another 5 minutes.
Right. So, yeah. I think he actually thought he was going to get us to pay for his fun. But After the money was transferred over to her, we rushed in and stopped the sexual act from occurring. But the funny thing is, from the time we left the van to go into the prison, she had taken the money and hid it in the heel of her shoe. Her heel would click open, just like you would see
James
in a movie.
Bond.
Yeah.
A James Bond type thing. She put the money in there. I had two female sergeant and a female lieutenant search her. They came out and they said, "There's no money." I said, "I know she has the money. We saw her take the money from the inmate." And I said, "Search her again, check everything, check the shoes, check everything." After the second search, they came out with the shoe and said, "Look, the money's in the heel of the shoe." But
And you confronted her with this. You're like, "Hey, here's the money. We have, made a copy of this." And
since she denied, she said, "I don't have the money." I think she was just banking on, look, she probably thought, I'm caught, I'm busted, but maybe they'll miss the money. You know, the money would be a key element if you went to court to prove
That
your
and the
case.
video
She thought-
recording.
That in the video recording.
what happened to her? She obviously lost her job. but
She
what-
ended up on probation. It'll tell you in the book. She ended up on probation. You know, these staff members don't have a prior record, or they wouldn't be working at the prison. So
Right,
a lot of them plea out to a year or two probation for some of these offenses.
I don't know. I don't think that that's enough. I just don't think it's enough. I think people that engage in public corruption
Unless
should be
they're
held
my
to-
client.
Let's have it be my client. In which case, they deserve to get pretrial intervention. But no, as a general rule, I think we entrust officers. We give them badges, we give them guns, but more than anything else, we give them our trust. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with holding them to a higher standard. And it is when it's difficult enough to make your way through the prison system, and we want these people to leave better than what they are coming in. And if we can't hire better people and change the culture, it just doesn't bode well.
And that's right. And that's why I don't buy the low pay theory. If you're going to stand up and swear to uphold the law and take the correctional officer oath, you accepted that pay. You need to uphold the law and be an honest officer.
Yeah, don't act like you're a victim. Like, I had to do it because you're paying me.
Right. I'm not paid enough. No, that's no excuse.
No, I wasn't suggesting that it was.
I know.
But it just in terms of that earlier in the show we were talking about that. But I do believe that we need to be paying our prison guards better, because that is an amazingly difficult job.
And I've always said they need to pay more. Pay them more money and put in the polygraph and put in the psychological exam, and I bet you would see a drop in the corruption. You're not going to stop all corruption in a prison. There's no way. But I bet you could get these statistics I have here in front of me a lot lower than they are right now.
Gary, is it fair to say that the contraband with the most potential to cause harm would be a cell phone?
Cell phones are very dangerous, and of course a weapon, and cell phones are being smuggled in left and right into the prison system. Even though the officers aren't allowed to take cell phones into the prison, it's just like marijuana. You're not allowed to have marijuana in the prison, but they're going to smuggle it in anyway. Cell phones are used for escapes. They can tell the people on the outside where the officers are located. It's just dangerous for everybody for a cell phone to be in the prison.
Well, they're running their gangs from these jails, aren't they?
They're running their gangs from the prison to the street by cell phone. They're running their drugs by the cell phone, because all calls are recorded in the prison. But if you have a cell phone, you can do all your drug business and gang business without it being recorded. And you would not believe the number of cell phones recovered in every prison in this state.
How often do you guys do like a shakedown or a check of people's quarters, the inmates' residential area?
The prison is responsible for surprise shakedowns. And don't get me wrong, they are doing their shakedowns. But they're only finding, as much as they can find, and some of it they don't find.
They're just very clever about hiding it. I mean,
It's hidden all over. They have them not only hidden in their cells, but they're buried all over the prison compound. There'll be times when they do a shakedown, and there'll be 6 or 7 officers with Geiger counters looking for shanks, homemade weapons.
All right, well, we've got to wrap this up. Listen, I want to tell you, Mr. York, how great it's been having you on. Folks, it's a terrific book, Corruption Behind Bars by Gary York. Get on Amazon.com, get on Google, and get yourself a copy. Until next week, we thank you for tuning in to Lawtalk.